The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is a very meaningful game to me. 7 years ago, when I was in high school, I had just gotten a Switch for Christmas, specifically to play Smash Ultimate. I honestly had no intention of using it for anything else, until one day I realized that the Nintendo Switch online service I had to pay for anyway came with a ton of free retro games. I had tried out emulation for a few older games like Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, but at that point I was mostly playing a few games on Steam and a few on my family's old Wii, not to mention the questionable number of hours I put into Geometry Dash. From growing up playing Smash and watching some YouTubers, I knew that Zelda was one of Nintendo's premium series, but I didn't really know what the games were about. I booted up the Super Nintendo NSO app one day and decided to try out A Link to the Past, and a Switch was irreversibly flipped in my head. The game absolutely blew my mind, and I immediately placed it in my top 5 favorite games of all time. The Zelda formula was a perfect fit for my taste in games, with a focus on exploration and puzzles, and the dungeons especially were huge standouts. Nowadays, I'm a big Zelda fan and I owe it all to A Link to the Past. Recently, I tried out the Oracle games and talked about their dungeons. That was my first time playing through those games, and to be completely honest, it's probably the last. Meanwhile, I'm pretty familiar with A Link to the Past at this point, having played it a good 3 to 4 times in the past and having played a randomizer a few times, although I haven't played it in at least 2 years by now. I'm excited to go through this game's dungeons with an analytical eye and rank each of them now that I have some experience. If you haven't seen my previous videos, I'll also give a brief review of the game at the end, so if you're interested in hearing my current opinion on the game as a whole, make sure to stay for that. So, let's get started. Actually, first I want to touch on the very beginning of the game. After some brief introductory text about the game's story, you get immediately thrown into a mini-dungeon as you try to rescue Zelda from Hyrule Castle. I absolutely love that they waste no time whatsoever in getting you introduced to the structure and gameplay, which seems like it would have been even more important back in 1992 when this game basically started the Zelda series as we know it today. It hits all the points it needs to: basic combat, keys and locks, how to use the lantern, getting the dungeon map, and the introduction of dungeon items with the boomerang, which is a perfect item to start out with. I'm not going to judge it as a full dungeon since that's not really the point of it, but in just a few short minutes you know exactly what you're going to get from the game in a fun and memorable sequence. It got 16-year-old me immediately hooked on the formula. You also get to play out some story beats yourself by taking the sword from your dying uncle, going to rescue Zelda, then making your escape to the sanctuary. I really do love this opening, but let's get to talking about some actual dungeons now. The first complete dungeon in the game, the Eastern Palace, is a good start. It does a great job of introducing you to the full dungeon structure by first having you navigate blind before handing out the dungeon map in a room you actually have to put in some effort to get to. The entrance is pretty memorable, with left and right rooms that lead to bottomless pits and a middle path with a few enemies. These are followed up by this room with some metal balls rolling at you that force you to get used to the movement controls. The structure of this dungeon is pretty well thought out, with a short linear intro before it opens up to a much larger main section. At this point you're introduced to 2 more separate paths on the left and right, and a lower level with some enemies and an enticing big chest just sitting there in your field of view. After this, it closes in one more time to get you to the boss with a small gauntlet of rooms. Along the way are a few optional rooms that are there specifically to reward exploration, like this dark room full of rupees. This kind of structure allows for some meaningful choices from the player without ever letting you get too lost, which is exactly what an intro dungeon should do. The boss is pretty fun too, with these 6 knights that take a ton of damage from the bow and arrow, but you can still use your sword as a fallback option in case you run out. This definitely isn't my favorite intro dungeon in the series, but it serves its purpose well, which gets it a high B tier. The Desert Palace mixes up the dungeon structure pretty early into the game. We start out in a huge open area, with one giant room connecting to a bunch of small side rooms, many of which are completely optional. You can even exit the dungeon through the right and leftmost rooms as soon as you enter, and realize there's another whole entrance behind the main building, inaccessible until you get the item, the Power Glove. This entrance leads to a short linear section of combat-centric rooms before the boss. This structure is a great idea for an early game dungeon, but that's really all the Desert Palace has going for it, and the rest never really clicked with me. The starting section is kind of boring, as everything here is really simple and empty, except for a bunch of pace-breaking enemies that force you to stop and defeat them. The second half is a bit better, with a few faster-paced rooms before the boss. I also like the boss itself. These worms that jump in and out of the ground make for a simple and effective fight. After playing so many Zelda bosses that follow the classic formula of expose the weak spot, then attack and repeat, I really appreciate not having to wait around for so long. Something weird I also noticed is that there are a ton of torches you can light that do absolutely nothing, so I'm not sure why they're even there. Those rooms mostly have nothing interesting to do anyway, so I think they could have added some more puzzles or something in their place. In any case, this is definitely an okay dungeon, just not one that I care much about. The definition of a low B tier. Next up is the Tower of Hera, which is more my speed. After the wide open and flat desert palace, now we have a fast-paced climb up a tall tower, switching up the structure once again. The first thing you see when you enter the tower is the introduction of these crystal switches, raising and lowering the red and blue blocks. They're used everywhere here, leading to some simple and satisfying puzzles. It's cool how if you walk past the two obvious entrances, you can get the big key at the very beginning of the dungeon, essentially opening up the whole thing right away. The challenge comes not from puzzling your way around, but instead climbing up a bunch of obstacle-ridden floors, with these bouncy enemies that push you around if you hit them, and pits everywhere that drop you back to the lower floors if you accidentally get pushed in. I find this annoying in a good way, if that makes any sense. There are also these panels that swap the locations of pits, and you can use these to your advantage with some planning by killing the enemies with them. There's also a few times where you have to realize you need to drop through a specific pit to find an item, which is a kind of puzzle I always love. The boss, Moldorm, is infamous, but I absolutely love how tense it is. You have to make sure you don't attack without thinking it through, or else you get bounced back to the lower floor, making the boss reset its health once you come back. You can only attack the tail, but the boss moves so erratically that this can be really tough and forces you to think fast at all times. I think my only real gripe with this dungeon is that you don't use the item, the Moon Pearl, at all here. This item is extremely required to progress through the game, allowing you to act normally in the Dark World instead of being transformed into a helpless bunny. It's not used in the dungeon even once, and is locked behind the toughest puzzle in the whole dungeon. That makes it really easy to completely pass it by without realizing, leading to tons of confusion later. But other than that, this is great, easily the highlight of the early game, and it never gets old for me on replay. I give it a well-deserved high A tier. The final dungeon in the first act is the siege on Hyrule Castle. I feel like ranking this one with all the others is maybe a bit unfair since it's maybe more of a mini-dungeon, but considering there are some legitimately great mini-dungeons in the series, I felt like including it anyway. This is a very straightforward combat gauntlet. You just go through a bunch of rooms one after another with a few tough enemies, and that's pretty much it. Well, at least they would be tough, but if at any point you reach full health, the Master Sword's beam attack just makes short work of the entire dungeon, as most of the enemies can only attack at close or medium range. I love the music here, and at least this is a tense moment in the story, so it does do what it's supposed to. The boss, Ganon, is kind of annoying and was a roadblock the first time I played this game. The concept is good, you have to hit his attacks back at him. But his attacks are random and only one type can be deflected. Another attack fills the screen with lightning, so you don't really want to be in his way, making deflecting the attacks feel kind of inconsistent. This is probably the worst dungeon in the game, but it's not really trying to be the best anyway. I'll give it a C tier. After beating Ganon in Hyrule Castle, he sends you to the Dark World, and now the game really begins. Immediately you're sent to the aptly named Palace of Darkness. This is the alternate version of the Eastern Palace, and immediately shows off how much more of a challenge the game will be from now on. The start plays on the Eastern Palace by turning the two side paths that go nowhere into tough required sections that lead to keys you need to progress in the main path. There are some really cool puzzles here, like this one where you can push a block and see it fall to the floor below, letting you know you can do the same. Doing this doesn't get you much of anything though, so you need to realize you have to fall down the other side of the room by breaking the bridge on the other side with a bomb, going down the hole you made, and finally getting the big key. The magic hammer is a great item, doing a ton of damage to enemies and pushing down pegs so you can progress. It's also used against the enemies here a lot, with these turtle things you have to knock over by hammering the ground. And the boss, where you have to hammer its armored front repeatedly before hitting its exposed head with the sword. It'll also be used a lot in the Overworld later, opening up a ton of different paths. This dungeon is also filled with a huge variety of rooms, meaning that even when you have to backtrack, which is pretty likely considering how many keys and puzzles there are, you won't be bored. There's this room where you have to outrun the falling floor, a twisting room with some crystal switches, jumps over pits, and a bumper at the center, this dark room with enemies everywhere after you get the hammer, and the main room with multiple paths that shows off an apparently unreachable chest, just to name a few. The backtracking is also helped out by a few shortcuts that get opened up by the hammer. This is a really great dungeon, and exactly what I was hoping for out of the Dark World. It'll go at the top of A tier. The Swamp Palace actually does something kind of weird. You can enter it without being able to start the dungeon, twice. First, from the very start of the game, you can unleash the water in the starting room to get a piece of heart outside. Second, if you show up without the flippers in the Dark World, you can't do anything before you go get them. Just thought I'd point that out, even if it doesn't change my opinion of the dungeon. This is the first water manipulation dungeon in the series, which would definitely come to be a bit of a mainstay, and though they can be contentious, I always enjoyed them. This is definitely the simplest of them though, with no water level swapping shenanigans. You just flip a switch to flood an area with water, acting as another kind of basic lock and key. The simple approach here works pretty well, and the dungeon is actually surprisingly linear, but in a good way. You progress down the main path, then as soon as you notice an area that looks like something's missing, your goal is to figure out how to open the floodgates somewhere nearby. The structure here isn't anything too crazy, but it definitely works as intended. Outside of the water, there's this big central room containing the dungeon item that you see really early on. Unfortunately, this room and a few others have these annoying water things that bounce around and never drop any health, so I'd say the enemies here aren't my favorite. Anyway, this time our item is the introduction of the hook shot, which is always amazing, although I do wish the Swamp Palace made some more use of it. By the time you get it, it's basically just a straight shot to the boss, and then you're done. By the way, that boss is so much fun. You use the hook shot to grab pieces off of it one by one and attack them, and once you finish that phase, the boss slams itself around the room in desperation. This isn't my favorite dungeon in the game or anything, but it doesn't do anything wrong except only minor annoyances, and is fast-paced enough to be a consistently good time. I think it just slides into A tier. Oh boy, it's time to talk about Skull Woods. To this day, it's one of the most insane dungeons in the series, and at least for me, it's an unambiguously positive form of insanity. Skull Woods takes place in the underground of the Dark World's Lost Woods, and it milks everything out of that setting that it can. There are 5 different entrances here. 3 of them are traditional dungeon entrances, but 2 of them are inconspicuous holes above ground that you can intentionally fall through to reach new locations. Depending on where you decide to enter, certain sections are opened while others are closed off. You can literally see the big chest in the very first room you enter, if you happen to choose that one first. This means the entire dungeon becomes one giant puzzle of deciding when and where you need to re-enter to get to new locations. I can't remember a single other dungeon like this in the entire series, at least until Echoes of Wisdom recently did something similar. This structure culminates in an endgame puzzle where you know you've solved the whole dungeon except one specific section that's unreachable. You have to look at the map and make the choice to exit the dungeon and go search for one last entrance to the northwest, with this giant skeleton you have to destroy with the fire rod you just acquired. Sure, maybe it doesn't make much sense to burn a skeleton like this, but the logic of using your dungeon item on an interesting looking object is more than enough for me. The dungeon itself is full of hard-hitting enemies and pits everywhere, meaning you can't be reckless at any point, even while your brain is fully engaged trying to solve this huge navigation puzzle. You can't even be reckless in the overworld, as if you die while outside the dungeon, you're going all the way back to the main spawn point at the center of the Dark World. Yeah, maybe that was a bit much. The only other issue I have here is the boss, which is just way too chaotic for its own good. The boss randomly moves around while shooting massive attacks at you, the floor shifts in random directions, spikes fly around in and out of the walls, and the game even experiences a ton of slowdown trying to process all this. I don't love it, but the good here is way more than enough for me to overlook an annoying boss. Despite how hard Skull Woods was on my first playthrough, I've always looked forward to it every time I replay this game. It gets an A+ tier. If not for the boss, this would be an easy S tier, and even as is, it's up there with my favorite 2D dungeons in the series. Well, it seems like we can only go down from there, as Thieves Town is easily my least favorite traditional dungeon in the game. First of all, I've always hated the way you enter the dungeon. There's a gargoyle statue which clearly looks like the entrance to a dungeon, but you seemingly can't do anything to get in. The only thing that works is your niche ability to grab and pull on a wall. This was only used one single time in the game before this, and that was on a movable statue in the Skull Woods. Maybe there's a hint for this somewhere, but I somehow forget this is what you have to do every single time I play the game. It just sucks. But now for the actual dungeon, I have to say it really doesn't improve all that much from here. On paper, this dungeon is kind of interesting, I guess. You begin with a wide open intro section, then go up a floor to break open the ground there to let some light shine through, then down to the basement to meet Blind the Thief and take her back up to where the light is shining, where she turns into the boss. Pretty cool idea, but there's an issue. It just isn't fun. The main section is these 4 confusing rooms with a lower and upper level, where the upper level obscures the floor below it. This means enemies will just hide in places they're impossible to see and surprise you from off screen. They even decide to prank you with these star things that turn you into a bunny, which are also hidden off screen and often impossible to react to. This whole area just needed some more thought put behind it, since it's really just not fun to play at all. The lower and upper sections really don't have all that much to do either, so they kinda just get overshadowed by the strange intro section. The boss is also not very fun, using the difficulty design of throwing stuff all over the screen, which is just kind of annoying. I guess at least it's not quite as bad as the previous boss, but that's not really saying much. I'm not really sure what happened with Thieves Town. It feels like a completely different team designed this dungeon compared to the others, and not in a good way. It's not fun to play, and has a few okay ideas that just aren't implemented all that well. If that isn't a C-tier dungeon, I don't know what is. It's certainly not the worst in the series or anything, but it just doesn't do anything for me. Right after finishing Thieves Town, you can just go straight to the Ice Palace using the Titan's Mitt. This is a pretty notorious dungeon, and I can understand why. The ice physics suck, although at least it's not quite as bad as Oracle of Seasons was. And even outside of that, this is a pretty tough dungeon that takes a lot of combat and brainpower to make your way through. Not only is this somehow taller than the Tower of Hera with 7 entire floors, but you'll often need to make your way down a few floors, find another route, then double back for some of the required items. Again, you can just completely miss the dungeon item. At least this time it's the blue mail, which is extremely useful, cutting all damage in half, but also not at all required to beat the game, so it's not the worst in my opinion. The enemies here do a boatload of damage, especially these ice statues that also bolt at you quickly and can honestly be kind of scary. So yeah, the dungeon is long, difficult in multiple ways, and has some brutal ice physics, but I honestly still like it. I appreciate that the layout here is pretty confusing and non-linear, looping back on itself repeatedly and not in a way that helps you out. Unlike the previous dungeon, which is annoying and also kind of boring, the Ice Palace is full of pretty challenging navigation puzzles that are rewarding to solve, even if they do take a while. For example, you can stumble onto the room with the big key as soon as the first minute or two, but your path is blocked, so you'll need to come back through a different entrance. That entrance requires you to go all the way down to floor 5 on the left side, and come back up on the right side while avoiding a bunch of distractions along the way. That definitely felt really good to figure out. It also pulls a Palace of Darkness by making you fall through a hole, notice you have to fall on the left side, go back up and bomb the floor to reach the big chest. It might be a redone puzzle, but it's still great. Some of the optional items, like the Bombos Medallion, help out a lot in clearing the rooms full of a bunch of enemies. There's a lot of room variety as well, which as you've probably noticed by now, I really like. Stuff like this central room you rotate around, icy paths with the fire bar you have to speed through, and this back and forth conveyor belt with enemies and spikes really help make the dungeon feel more interesting. It is annoying that you can just fall into the boss room with no way to beat it if you don't have enough magic power remaining though. The boss otherwise isn't bad, but also not my favorite. I mostly don't love the ice falling from the ceiling, and it maybe takes a bit long to kill each eyeball. I still like this dungeon enough to put it at the very top of B tier. There's lots of good here that is unfortunately still held back by the ice physics and the annoying boss. It doesn't feel like it comes together cohesively, but I kind of like that since it stands out and is off-putting in an interesting way. I'm not really sure why, but I think of Misery Mire as a much better version of Thieves Town. I don't really know why those two always blend together in my head. The giant room with 2 overlapping levels from Thieves Town is back, but this time it's much better. The upper floor here is see-through, so you can actually tell what's going on, and it's only confined to 1 big room this time instead of 4. The layout is also much more interesting, as you have to use the upper floor to double back after unlocking some of the outside rooms, which is a pretty satisfying moment. The dungeon as a whole feels like you're untangling a knot, and I really like that. The Cane of Samaria is kind of a boring item here, as you really only have to use it one single time in the whole dungeon, and it doesn't do much outside of that anyway. plus its hitbox is really janky. At least the crumbling floor on the way to get it is a fun set piece. Enemies here are fun to fight, with these wizrobes forcing you to be patient and mixing well with the other enemy types. I love the room with 2 long bridges taking you to a completely new section, and the dark room here is cool as well. The boss is a good time too. The best strategy is actually just to mash the attack button and hope you get a good pattern. It does work most of the time and is actually pretty tense, so I don't mind this boss at all. I love that the big key immediately warps you to where you need to go, but this doesn't mean you're done, you just know where the next section is. It's actually kind of funny that they only started doing this kind of thing in one of the last dungeons, but hey, it's appreciated nonetheless. There's also a cool section where you have to quickly light lanterns in 2 rooms next to each other, with a hint next door in case you need it. Mire is absolutely packed with small keys, and you don't even need to use all of them. This means you have a ton of freedom in how you complete the dungeon, making it pretty non-linear. A good chunk of it is actually completely optional, which is great for the psychos who don't 100% the dungeons. Mire is always a great time and one of the best dungeons in the game. I'm having a hard time deciding between A and A+ tier, but in the end I think it gets an A. Even if it is really fun, it doesn't stand out to a crazy degree. Now Turtle Rock is a pretty interesting penultimate dungeon. The difficulty here is cranked up, but not to an unreasonable degree, and it still has plenty of its own gimmicks to stand out. You have these eyes that shoot if you look at them, these platforms you activate with the Cane of Samaria that follow along some tracks, and these pipes that twist all over the place and spit you out at some random location. I really like all of these, although I have to say the last moving platform section is kind of annoying. It's in the dark, there's fire bars everywhere that you can't see, tons of different overlapping routes, and you have to find one specific button to place a block on with a Cane of Samaria's janky hitbox. Yeah, maybe a bit overdesigned. The mirror shield is used to block the eye's attacks in a few sections, which is actually a pretty cool use case for such a late game item. There are also a few new enemy types, like these blob stacks that launch pieces of themselves at you when you attack. I absolutely love to pieces how this dungeon gives you permanent checkpoints by letting you go outside and come back in, strategically placing one a few rooms before the boss. It doesn't even have any other purpose than to save your progress. And boy will you need it, because the boss is just brutal and I love it. It's a turtle that has 3 heads, one weak to fire, one weak to ice, and a third one that jumps out at you when the tail starts wagging quickly. You have to destroy the elemental heads by hitting them with the opposite rod, then getting a few hits in with the sword. Then the main head chases you all around the arena in a legitimately terrifying desperation attack. This is such a cool boss, and I don't mind it being really hard since the game gives you a nice health grinding spot right before in case you need it, and a full magic refill. Watch out though, because if you run out of magic power you literally just lose, since that's the only way to damage the elemental heads. My main complaint though is that the ice rod was completely optional up until now, so if you didn't get it you'll have to search literally the entire world for it and come back. It's very unlikely that you'll miss it since it's in the most obvious location for a secret item I've ever seen, but it's still possible and I hate the idea of showing up to the end of a dungeon without the required items. This dungeon is difficult but very memorable and a lot of fun, even if I do have a few problems with it. This means it also gets a high A tier. Now we've finally reached the end, the last dungeon of A Link to the Past. Surprising absolutely nobody, I think Ganon's Tower is fantastic. But I'd go further than that. It's easily one of the best final dungeons in any game I've ever played, in any genre, and easily the best dungeon in A Link to the Past with no contest whatsoever. Yep, it's time for me to gush, because I don't think this dungeon has a single flaw, and the high points are so unbelievably high that I was literally smiling ear to ear playing through it. You start off on an absolutely massive lower floor, where every single room has its own specific flair and the variety is literally off the charts, to the point that if I tried listing everything the rooms do down here that I like, I'd have to add another 15 minutes to the video. The in-room puzzles in this section are just so cool. There's a timed dash over a path you can only see for a limited amount of time, jumping between 2 rooms with portals, a room with fireballs blasting through 4 corridors, so you have to weave between them and search for a pushable block, creating a chest to hookshot to, and so much more. You even refight the first boss in the game, except harder since now there's ice all over the battlefield. Don't worry though, there's a room you can find that offers 4 fairies to fill up your empty bottles with that act as health refills, and you will need them. After finding the big key, you can get the red mail, which drastically increases your defense. A perfect final dungeon item. But if you can believe it, it gets even better from there. Now you have to climb up 7 floors to the very top, in a section that's supposed to be reminiscent of Hyrule Castle, but amps it up to a ridiculous degree. They throw basically every obstacle from the entire game at you at some point during the ascent, and there are even refights of the other 2 early game bosses, again with extra stuff thrown in to increase the challenge. You'll see all kinds of enemies, things shooting at you everywhere, crumbling floors, rotating fire bars with timed dashes to the door as you light lanterns, cool crystal switch rooms, and like I said before, so much more that I can't even begin to describe it all. It all ends with a rematch against Ganon, except this time there are 3 of him. And for some reason this fight is actually way easier than the first one, since the clones always shoot the magic you need to deflect, meaning you have way more chances to get a hit in. This also means I like it a lot more than the first fight. The dungeons up to this point have been pretty varied, and it all culminates in this one final gauntlet that decides to do all of it and more, and somehow succeeds so well that it feels divinely inspired. I'd call it the best 2D dungeon in the entire series, but I'd have to go back to the other games before I can confidently say that. We'll see in the future if anything tops this. The thing is, I don't even think most final Zelda dungeons are all that great. Most of them are just a few bosses in a row, maybe with a few puzzles along the way. In my videos on the Oracle games, I didn't even mention any final dungeons because they literally don't exist. There's just a few rooms with basic enemies before the final boss. This means I can truthfully say that Ganon's Tower being a final dungeon doesn't bias me at all. It really is just that good, completely on its own merits. But I don't need to be here for the next 15 minutes telling you this again and again. It should be pretty obvious at this point. Ganon's Tower is an S-tier dungeon, no question. I reserve S-tier for the dungeons that are truly the best of the best, and this is one of them. So yeah, that's all the dungeons of A Link to the Past covered. This is a fantastic selection, with 7 that I'd consider great, and only 2 or 3 that I don't like all that much. With 12 entire dungeons, that's an amazing showing. In case you were wondering, here's the full tier list with all the games I've covered. But that means it's time to talk about the rest of the game. How has A Link to the Past held up over 30 years later? Well, as I talked about before, the game starts off firing on all cylinders with a great opening section. I already talked about the introductory mini-dungeon, but even outside of that, in just the first hour you get a ton of game-changing new items one after another. You get the lantern right away, then the boomerang which makes combat much more comfortable, then the bow and arrow, which is fine, then the Pegasus boots, which let you charge up a dash with your sword in 4 directions. They make traversal so much better, and even give you another option in combat if you need one. This game could have been so much worse if not for the Pegasus boots. They really are a godsend, and I use them every chance I can get. You can also talk to NPCs and open doors by dashing into them with your sword like this, and I don't know, I just find that really funny for some reason. The early game especially has amazing player direction, meaning you don't have to search all that hard for where to go, just how to get there. This mostly keeps up for the rest of the game as well, although there are a few snags later on. I think the combat, especially at the beginning of the game, is just okay. The sword swing has a tiny bit of startup to it that makes it a little hard to use sometimes, and I noticed there's a bit of a blind spot that makes it hard to hit enemies that break through your defenses. This makes it pretty easy to get comboed for a ton of damage. Luckily, you get a ton of options over the course of the game. Charging up a spin attack has great coverage and does a decent amount of damage. Once you get the Master Sword especially, the game becomes way more fun to play, since you get this awesome beam attack at full health, and the range and damage are better. Some items like the boomerang, bow, hookshot, and elemental rods give you plenty of longer ranged options in case you don't want to get up close. I particularly like using the hookshot, even if it is a little clunky. You get a bunch of invincibility frames, and it kills smaller enemies while stunning some bigger ones, with a crazy range to it as well. There are also a ton of optional items you don't have to get, like upgrades for your sword and boomerang, and the magic cape and cane of Birna, which provide invincibility and protection. I actually opted not to get those 2 items on this playthrough, because I was just more interested in getting through the dungeons. Yeah, let's go with that. I definitely didn't forget how to get them. Despite the basic combat being just okay, I think the bosses are mostly pretty great. Almost all of them are 2-phase fights, where the first phase is focused on dodging attacks from multiple directions, and the second phase is a high-intensity fight to the death. This formula works really well and stands out in the Zelda series. Most other Zelda games have you repeat one action, whether that's exposing a weak spot with an item and hitting it a few times, or just whacking them over and over until they die. Now, I'm not going to say most Zelda bosses are bad, and I actually think a lot of the other games have better bosses than A Link to the Past. But I am saying it's refreshing to have something different for a change. There are certainly a few annoying fights, like the ones in Thieves Town and especially Skull Woods, but those are the minority if you ask me. I was talking about some optional items before, so now it's time to talk about the overworld design, since that's how you get most of them. To put it simply, it's great. From the moment you finish the intro in Hyrule Castle, you can explore almost the entire light world except for a few sections that are gated off by the dungeon items you get in the 3 early game dungeons. Most of these are gated by the Power Glove, which lets you pick up the heavy rocks you see everywhere. I love this because there are actually a surprising number of things to do in the overworld. There are a bunch of pieces of heart you can find to increase your max health, some pretty simple side quests, and of course, useful items everywhere. The locations in the overworld are pretty varied and memorable. There's the desert area in the bottom left, a lake section in the bottom right, Zora's Domain where you get the flippers up in the top right, Death Mountain at the top, and the Lost Woods at the top left. The center of the map is maybe a bit less interesting, mostly being a wide open area, but there are a few narrow paths that can get a bit confusing. You might need to pull up the map pretty often to get around, which is at least pretty detailed, so it's not that much of an issue. The map also marks the next dungeon very well, so you'll never be confused as to where your next main objective is. There are a few moments where you have to do something just a bit too specific before your main objective, and like other Zelda games, these are definitely my least favorite parts. I will say though, A Link to the Past luckily only has 2 or 3 moments like this, which is not too bad. The first is how you get the flute, a very useful item which acts as the game's fast travel, and becomes required to get to Misery Mire. There's this conspicuous forest clearing near the center of the map where you can see a ghostly figure playing the flute, but can't do anything about it yet. Once you unlock the Dark World, you can go back to the forest and find the Flute Boy, yes, that is his actual name, and he gives you a shovel and tells you to go back to the forest in the Light World and dig up the spot where most of the animals run to. Doing this will get you the flute. If you come back to the Flute Boy, he'll ask you to play it one last time and says his father in the town should hear it as well. So you go back to the town, find an old man and play it for him. You then have to talk to him again and he'll tell you to play it for the bird statue at the center of the town, which finally activates your fast travel. This is honestly a really nice quest that's surprisingly sad given the year this game released, and I do like it a lot. The issue is that a lot of the steps you have to take are very specific and easy to miss. If you happen to mash through the Flute Boy's text quickly, you're basically out of luck and have to consult a guide, which can get pretty confusing and had me lost for literal hours the first time I played the game. Unfortunately, the absolute worst moment in the entire game comes right at the very end. If you start the final fight against Ganon, you'll see it's actually a pretty cool fight. But try as you might, there's no way to beat him. You can use all your items, all your techniques, and nothing will work. You're essentially required to leave the fight and go search for something else to beat him. What you have to do is go to this bomb shop, which is where Link's house is in the Dark World. Normally the shop just sells very overpriced bombs, but all of a sudden they're selling a super bomb, and you have to bring it to this cracked wall by Ganon's pyramid. If you haven't gotten the upgraded sword yet, you actually have to go do that first. It makes no sense whatsoever that this is what causes the super bomb to appear, and I hate it every single time that Zelda games do things like this. The upgraded sword is very cool, but it should just be an upgrade, not fully required to beat the game. On second thought, maybe I should have dinged Turtle Rock more for requiring the apparently optional Ice Rod. Anyway, now you find a great fairy who gives you the silver arrows, and these are how you beat Ganon. Just a horrible, horrible moment to dump on you at the very end of the game when you're just ready to beat Ganon and move on. If you're not using a guide, this is basically just a complete waste of your time. I'm not even kidding that this moment alone brings the game down for me from like a 9.75 to a 9.25 out of 10. I know that doesn't sound like much, but it pushes A Link to the Past out of my top 3 Zelda games, so I consider it a pretty big deal. Luckily though, I don't really think these moments are enough to ruin what is otherwise a fantastically designed overworld. Aside from those memorable locations I talked about before, we have the Light and Dark World version of every area in the game, and this is one of the absolute best parts of A Link to the Past. In fact, almost half the games in the series basically copy the Light and Dark World structure because it worked so well the first time. Pretty early on, you'll unlock the ability to go through portals to the Dark World, and this opens up the game to a crazy degree. All of a sudden, you have a whole new world to explore, and the moment you beat Aghanim and are transported to the top of the Golden Pyramid looking over the entire world is legitimately breathtaking. And of course, a huge part of that is the amazing Dark World theme. As an aside, the music in this game is great, with plenty of absolutely iconic tracks. My personal favorite will always be the Dark World, but you also have Hyrule Castle, Zelda's Lullaby, the two Ganon themes, and even the boss theme, which I literally still use as my alarm, because... The only real issue with the music is that all 8 Dark World dungeons play the same song, and it's not one of the better ones either, so that can get slightly grating for some people from what I've heard. Not me though, I don't mind it. But back to the overworld itself, the Dark World is essentially one massive puzzle, and works a lot like a Metroidvania. Most of it isn't immediately available, but as you get more items and explore, more portals into the Dark World pop up, and considering you can always swap back to the Light World with the Mire, this leads to some awesome sections where you have to find a creative way to get to a new area of the world. Most of these portals are in pretty conspicuous locations, so there's no frustration as long as you explore to any decent degree. This makes locations like Skull Woods and especially Death Mountain a blast to explore, with caves everywhere that lead to a bunch of fun puzzles, and each location also has a few optional things to grab that are gated behind late game items. This means backtracking is consistently rewarded if you want to do so. Most of the time, where you have to go next isn't too out of the way. Even if it is, something really cool that I noticed on this playthrough is that the majority of mandatory items you find in the overworld you can get at basically any time. The Ice Rod and the Ether and Quake medallions can be found as soon as 1 to 2 hours into the game, and aren't required until the very end. You only need the medallions for the final 2 dungeons, the Flute for Misery Mire, and the Ice Rod for Turtle Rock, as stupid as it is that you only need it for the boss. They're also pretty easy to find, so it's pretty likely you'll get all of them before too long. An exception is the Flippers, which let you swim in water. You can get them as soon as you finish the Desert Palace, but they're required at the beginning of the Swamp Palace, and nobody really tells you where to get them. I don't think this is that bad though, since you're very likely to find them anyway through exploration, and on your way you get a hint as to where the Quake Medallion is. This is a cool way to get you to start thinking about what items you might need in the future. I admit that on my first playthrough I wasn't able to find them and had to break out a guide though. I also wasn't paying as much attention as I should have though, since you have all the tools available to get them whenever you want. Back to the dungeons again, I do think a lot of the late game dungeon items aren't all that special, but I get why, because if they kept adding more and more stuff to your inventory this late in the game, either they'd go underutilized or it could get pretty overwhelming. I was blown away by how much of this game is actually spent inside the dungeons. They're almost all really great, and most of them are surprisingly short, meaning the pacing of A Link to the Past is easily some of the best in the series. As soon as a dungeon wears out its welcome, it's basically already done, and you're moving on to a short exploration break, if you want one, before starting another dungeon. There are some sections where, assuming you front-loaded some of the exploration of the game like I did, you can literally exit one dungeon and walk to the next one immediately. This kind of non-linear progression is really cool. The ability to set the pacing yourself is something I wish more games did, rather than just asking you to do everything in a very prescribed order. In A Link to the Past, you absolutely can just go back and explore when you come across some kind of roadblock, or you can decide to search for extras on the way before you run into them. Playing through the Oracle games, which again I did enjoy, made me realize what I like and don't like in Zelda games, and A Link to the Past really has so much of what I like about the series. There's so little filler content, except for the silver arrows, which again are such a stupid moment to put to the end of the game. But outside of that, and maybe the flute quest, you get to spend time doing things that are actually fun, instead of wasting your precious time with lame fetch quests. So many Zelda games love to do this for some reason, and I just really don't get it. Now there's a very specific Zelda game I'm thinking about in particular, but I don't want to get flamed in the comments just yet. We'll save that for when I actually cover that game in the future. But I think that's about all I have to say about A Link to the Past. While I don't like it as much as I did on my first playthrough back when I had never played a game like this in my life, I still think it deserves all the credit it's gotten over the years, and it probably was the best game ever made back when it came out. That's not to say it hasn't aged well though, since I think it's actually aged a lot better than many Zelda games that came out after it. It's either my 4th or 5th favorite in the series, depending on the day, and still one of the most important games to me personally, even if I can see more flaws than I used to. And the dungeons are one of the main reasons why. I love A Link to the Past, and I'd highly recommend it as a starting point for anyone who wants to get into the series. It worked on me, so it might work on you too. Just don't be afraid to break out a guide a few times on your first playthrough. You might need one. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in more of this kind of content, please let me know. I had a ton of fun making this one, so I hope you'll stick around in the future if you made it this far. Thanks for watching.